On the right, there are always all sorts of debates about everything, which makes us so much better than the left, where there is tyrannical control over what you're allowed to say. But sometimes those debates actually are relevant to our lives, and then other times they're just debate for the sake of debate, and they don't affect us at all. For more on this, I want to turn to Emily Jashinsky. She's a culture editor at The Federalist. She's also the co-host of Counterpoints, and she joins us now. Emily, great to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me, Vince.
All right, so you've written this week for The Federalist, and the headline is Between the Old Right and New Right, There's One Fault Line That Matters. I guess we should start with the definitions here. How do you view the old right versus the new right?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I was on a panel at the American Political Science Association, which is, a bunch of professors basically trying to figure out what's happening on the right now. And they asked us to look at two statements, the national conservatism statement and the freedom conservatism statement. And the freedom conservatism statement was a response to the national conservatism statement. And they both kind of become proxy expressions of, the old right and the new right. So the old right being, sort of the free market fundamentalism, neoconservatism, probably best described actually as fusionism, which, in conservative movement circles is known as, when people brought together the idea of individual freedom, a strong national defense, and traditional values during the Cold War. And that was sort of the pillar of the conservative movement. The new right is, basically saying the idea of free markets, free enterprise has come at the expense of families. The primacy in the economy should be families first. Markets serve families. And so that kind of scrambles the priorities, it scrambles the agendas, and we're seeing that happen in the Republican Party right now when there's friction, for example, between Mitch McConnell and Ukraine, and the kind of, Mike Lee, J.D. Vance, people who are sort of representatives of a shifting party.
Yes.
And we saw that just play out last weekend.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you look at those three pillars that you talked about, the economic pillar, the foreign policy pillar, and the social pillar, it is true that conservatism has made gains insofar as you see as like, the highest federal income tax rate used to be in the 90 percentage points. That was back in the 1940s. And it has come down dramatically since then. So that's a win in terms of cutting taxes and improving the economic situation in that sense. Also on foreign policy, it does feel like we've never been in more wars simultaneously. Like we've done a lot of that. But the social side, I don't think that anyone looks at what's going on for families in America and for religion in America and thinks, man, that picture's really improved over the last half century. Things have gotten worse. So it's not surprising to hear that people who believe sincerely in the values portion of this are very concerned that they've been sold out.
Right. And I think that's such an interesting point because there are a couple of agenda items. And one example that I zoom in on is the Trump tax cuts of 2017, which I think were actually good for the middle class. I think they were good for business in the country more broadly. But I think just about everybody in the conservative movement now looks at and says, that was a huge expenditure of political capital on tax cuts. We here in D.C. remember the frenzy and all of the energy that was put into a tax cut bill, and that feels kind of wrong. It feels like maybe that should have gone somewhere else. Maybe we could have prevented what ended up happening in 2020 culturally if people had been properly sort of focused on these different issues. But at the same time, basically nobody on the so-called new right would say that those tax cuts that create a more business-friendly climate and save the middle class money were bad. Pretty much everybody agrees that those tax cuts were a good thing. Similarly, I think just about everybody on the new right would say some aid to Ukraine, military and humanitarian, is worthwhile. But Mitch McConnell is out saying that it's the most important thing Republicans can do right now. It's the most important thing Congress can do right now.
Right.
And I think that that's the real conflict on the right. It's not necessarily some of these fundamental questions. It's the principle of how important those questions are.
Right. And, look, there's a lot of people who believe, as I do, I think it's very important that you have strong families and strong communities. I think that's that's the whole point of our system, is to enable that. And human flourishing is found it's in capitalism. It's been the best economic system for human flourishing in world history. But when it's corrupted by cronyism, when it's corrupted just by corruption, when it's corrupted by giving money to countries where there is no accountability for how the money is used and spent, then that's when people start to get really upset that they're being sold out.
Absolutely. And if you look right now at what's happening with the UAW and the Biden administration, there was a study that came out, Fox News has a report on it, about energy subsidies from 2016 to 2022, and showed this vast prioritization of green energy subsidies over fossil fuels. And now, because the Biden administration has a policy that is pushing all of these car manufacturers, to go green in a really short time span, they're spending all of these subsidies in one direction to push all of these jobs away. There are fewer manufacturing jobs in green cars. And then it's just basically a repeat of what happened with NAFTA and WTO. Mm-hmm. We're pushing them this direction, but if you're one of those people that's lost in the crunch, you're screwed. And sorry, go to a different city, find different, it's the same thing, rinse and repeat. So I think that's a huge, huge, huge problem.
Right. And when when those American jobs disappear, they go to countries that play by very different rules. Like China is using slave labor to produce the goods that are coming into the United States. I mean, I'm for free markets, but I'm not for forced labor. And I'm not for intellectual property theft, and I'm not for American towns being gutted. I think that they should be flourishing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that debate is one of the biggest ones between, what people in D.C. and in the sort of conservative intelligentsia and broader intelligentsia are saying is like, these are fundamental areas of disagreements. You hear a lot of people on the sort of free con side characterize people on the nat con side as just outright socialists. And then people on the NatCon side characterizing the people on the FreeCon side as Randian, right? They just want markets for the sake of markets. And I don't think that's an accurate characterization of either side. There may be some fringe characters on either side, but I think at the end of the day, everybody looks at the history of capitalism over the last couple of centuries on the right more broadly and says, listen, we can agree on this, but there are all of these like personal grievances that are confusing the debate.
Yes.
The real question is basically, when you're exporting jobs to Mexico, to China, if you think of paper mills in my home state of Wisconsin that dried up and are now really depressed areas with drug addiction, should that pattern be repeated, or should there be policies that are more tailored to, helping those people flourish, those families flourish? I think obviously the answer has to be the latter, but a lot of people on the free con side would say, maybe, there just needs to be a total lack of regulation in that space. There are different conversations that can happen, but at least knowing to focus on what's happening to those families, I think, is the right starting point.
Right.
We can agree on.
Yeah, considering what your priorities are. Also, I think something that I've noticed of late on the right is the shift back to a recognition that the threats to you and your family don't only come from government. There's for a while, I think the right had taken this position that big government is the only problem. But what we've learned, I think, in great detail is big business, big nonprofits, big globalist organizations, they all, in their own ways, many of them have become threats to liberty. They've been tyrannical, and they've been wielding that power at our expense.
Such a good point. And it also brings up this question of the intelligence apparatus, which was broadly supported by just about everybody on the right, except for some of those, I think, prescient figures now like Ron and Rand Paul, who have kind of always been right on these questions. So conservatives, because of that three-legged stool we talked about earlier, I think lacked due skepticism. Not everyone. Andrew Breitbart years ago had verticals on Breitbart called Big Business, Big Hollywood, Big Media.
Yes.
But that sort of deference to business and the deference to the intelligence community, and that was on both the left and the right, if you look at votes for the Patriot Act, that deference has proven itself to be, I think, clearly a mistake. And there were understandable reasons why conservatives were overly trusting of institutions like business coming off the Cold War and coming off an era when there was absurd levels of regulation, absurd levels of taxation. There's a real, it's understandable why people often defer to business interests over the government. But, there's the history of conservatism is rooted in skepticism of everything big government and big business and big media.
Yes.
And I think that's a really important reevaluation.
Yeah, I mean, look at especially the big tech companies are an easy example of this. So Google controls over 90% of all search, which means they really control human knowledge. And they've clearly abused that power in the past. That is a threat to your liberty. If you can't even have knowledge about how to make decisions as a voter, then your liberty is definitely threatened by a big corporation. And those big tech companies, additionally, have become, through crony capitalism, through a corrupt relationship with the government, they've become the vehicles through which the government has trampled all over your various rights, including and especially the First Amendment. We're watching a major court case play out right now with the state of Missouri suit over this, where you have the big tech companies censoring at the urging of the government, the American people, especially around election time. It's just wild.
Yeah, that's such a great point, because you have then they work in concert. You have these big tech companies working in concert with big Intel. And if you look at, for instance, if you look at food, if you look at the relationship between the FDA, the ag industry, these things are like, actually, this is crony capitalism. And to return to the sort of abstract conversation that's happening on the right, and this conference is full of professors, both of those statements, both the free con statement and the nat con statement, specifically call out crony capitalism. So again, like, it is just really frustrating so often to hear personal grievances confuse the debate, because at the end of the day, that is another huge starting point that conservatives, and I'm not talking about politicians that are sort of bought and paid for by some of those industries, because they absolutely exist, but real ideological conservatives committed to conservative values, that is a starting point that should not be forgotten. Crony capitalism is a scourge, and it has created things like those hollowed out paper mills. Like, that's what's behind it. It's not just the ideological mistakes, it's also cronyism, and that's a starting point.
Yeah. I can't help but think, as you described this, of the case of Purdue Pharma. They worked hand in glove with people at the FDA to get OxyContin signed off on. And then when the FDA let it go without any warning about the addictive quality, it was being prescribed across the nation. It kicked off the opioid crisis. It killed a lot of American citizens. And the FDA guy who signed off on this ended up leaving the government and working for, you guessed it, Purdue Pharma, and got a ton of money for that. That is the kind of thing that Americans are literally dying from, but are so angry about when it comes to our system.
Absolutely. And why haven't, for example, Republican politicians, why were politicians basically on both sides, but specifically Republicans who should be in their blood skeptical of big business, big pharma? Why don't they talk about this? Big government. This is government overreach. It's government abuse. And it's the same thing on the pharma side. And that should have been, there's no reason the conservative movement should have been on the sidelines of that conversation for so long. It basically took until after the opioid crisis was ravaging the Rust Belt and places in New England and inner cities for any politicians to start talking about it. It was like 2015 before that became a huge issue in our politics. And that's way too late. And it shouldn't have been for the right, which has this history and legacy and ideology that should direct them to be skeptical of that marriage between big business and big government.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Emily Jashinsky, thank you for taking us under the hood here on some of the intellectual debates that are happening on the right. Again, human flourishing, I think, should be the priority. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time as always.
Thank you, Vince.
All right. Emily Jashinsky over at The Federalist.